Hello and welcome to the first of two, possibly three reviews on Chapter 54. This first review is going to talk about the people and the different organizations. These are coming from the questions that you guys asked on your self-reflections and the notes I've taken on the chapter. I hope this is helpful. So, on this section of the chapter review, we're talking about the people. If you group them together and then pull them over with the organizations, it'll make more sense. Jackie Robinson, he pretty much takes precedence on his own. I want to blow this up a bit. All right, this section of the review is going to deal with the people and the organizations. I'm going to start with the people. Jackie Robinson, fantastic baseball player. Broke the color barrier in the 1940s, the first African American to play in Major League Baseball. Up to that point in time, the baseball leagues had been segregated. You had the Negro Leagues. Pittsburgh had two Negro League championship teams in Pittsburgh, the Homestead Grays and the Pittsburgh Crawfords. You had some of the best baseball players in the world playing on those two teams. Jackie Robinson came to the major leagues, and he broke the color barrier for Major League Baseball. So we're going to scratch him out. Now the next two, Earl Warren and Thurgood Marshall. We'll hear about Thurgood Marshall, later also. Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he presided over many civil rights cases as Supreme Court Chief Justice. He's the former governor of California. He had a liberal background, and he helped guide the court to go pro-civil rights in many court cases. Thurgood Marshall, he was the lead attorney on Brown versus Board of Education for the NAACP. And he was the lead attorney for Brown versus Board of Education, arguing for desegregation, integration of schools. And he will come back to be a Supreme Court justice later. He will be the first African American appointed to the Supreme Court. Then the next two people we're going to discuss, Rosa Parks and James Blake. They have a history. It wasn't a very good history. James Blake was the bus driver. He had several run-ins with Rosa Parks. She, on the way home, refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white person and was arrested. She wasn't the first person arrested. That's kind of an urban legend, historical myth. Other people had been arrested, but Rosa Parks didn't want to give up her seat. She was arrested. She'd usually avoided James Blake, and those two are tied together. Those actions brought about the Montgomery bus boycott and helped integrate buses. Our next two people, let's pick purple. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy. They are involved with Rosa Parks through the Montgomery bus boycott. This is where Martin Luther King Jr. became a major player in the civil rights movement. He was low-key, he was a minister, and he helped form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the SCLC, with Ralph Abernathy. Those two helped organize some other organizations we're going to be talking about here on the list. But what they did was they organized the Montgomery bus boycott, and we'll talk about that under actions, but that basically opened up busing and desegregated busing. I'm going to pause this for a second so I can clean the board and slide down the list. The next two people on the list, and we'll go a different color now. We'll go this greenish yellow. Orville Faubus and Dwight D. Eisenhower. Ike was president of the United States in the 1950s. Orville Faubus was the Arkansas governor. He did not want to integrate the schools after Brown versus Board of Education. He fought it. By the way, This is Faubus. I know my handwriting's a little sketchy. I apologize for that. Governor Faubus, he brought in the National Guard during the incident in Little Rock, Arkansas. Allegedly, he was saying he was trying to protect the African American students who were trying to be integrated into the school. In reality, the National Guardsmen were keeping the African American students out of school. Dwight Eisenhower, who was not a hardcore civil rights activist, the president, he looked at things as being fair. He was angry that the governor was showboating, so he sent in airborne troops, Army Airborne, I believe it was the 101st Airborne, and he basically opened the schools with U.S. troops, and then turned around and took the National Guard out from under Orville Faubus, so he had no authority with the National Guard. And we'll talk about this under events. This played a big role in integrating things as time went on. Our next two people, let's go with red. Stokely Carmichael. He was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was one of the organizers. And James Farmer, CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. These two gentlemen were working with students, trying to get younger people involved in the civil rights group. And these are tied in here. These two gentlemen were younger. Stokely Carmichael come back later on when we talk about Black Power and how people's views changed. Both of these gentlemen were trying to get the young people active and motivated in the civil rights movement. Robert Kennedy, he was the Attorney General. He was JFK's younger brother. He's Attorney General for the United States. He was very active in civil rights and pushed for civil rights and used the government to enforce civil rights legislation. So let me scratch off Robert Kennedy. James Meredith, he shows up several times in the notes. He was the first student at the African-American student enrolled in the University of Mississippi. And later on a march, as an activist, he was shot. And that had, I don't want to say energized, but that motivated people to continue his march. He was going from Tennessee to, I believe, Mississippi, and he was shot on his walk. Others continued in his place and finished his walk, and that really got people motivated and moved the civil rights movement forward. The next man, I'm going to give him his own color. Bull Connor, in charge of police and public services down in Birmingham, I believe, down in Alabama. He, during the Children's March, we talked about this in class, he turned the police dogs and fire hoses on children who were marching to end segregation. And this was just a brutal incident. Once again, media played a role. People saw Bull Connor turning police dogs on to kids who were singing church hymns, turning fire hoses on children who were singing church hymns and marching peacefully, and it helped sway opinion. And we'll talk about that either at the end of the second installment or on the third installment if we do that on its own, which we probably will. Bull Connor, an infamous person involved in all of this. And we have two presidents. We will go blue. JFK, LBJ, both were Democrats. They followed Eisenhower as president. John F. Kennedy was president, pushed some legislation. After his assassination, Lyndon Baines Johnson took over, and he pushed through some of the civil rights legislation from Kennedy and pushed other programs for African Americans. James Earl Ray, He was the person convicted of assassinating Martin Luther King Jr. And we're going to pause here for a second while I clean up the board. As we pick up Malcolm Little, also known as Malcolm X, they are the same person. Very charismatic civil rights leader. He's tied to Elijah Muhammad, who was the second leader of the Nation of Islam, ran the Nation of Islam for a long time. They had a falling out. Malcolm Little started out as believing in black separatism. He did not want to see integration. He wanted to see a separation of the races. He felt that, and as did Elijah Muhammad and some other people who believed that the races should be separated. The whites did not have the best interest of the African Americans in their actions, and they pushed hard for segregation, a separate black region, African American region of the United States. And they pushed for black pride, black power, and felt that you fight violence with violence. Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, they formed the Black Panther Party. I believe the official title was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. They were also in that concept, and eventually Stokely Carmichael came over to the same thinking that they didn't want Caucasians, white Americans, helping out with the plight of African Americans. They thought should be black Americans, African Americans, pushing their own benefits and pushing to support themselves. They were into separate states, and that comes into play with the split between Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad. Malcolm X kind of through things, and as time went on, there was talk that he was starting to go closer towards, maybe not closer what Martin Luther King Jr. had said, but understanding there was nonviolence did play a part, and he was assassinated by members of the Nation of Islam before he could really put his new thoughts into action. That wraps up the people. We're going to come back in a second with the organization. Wow. I just recorded this section of the review and I forgot to hit record. So I drew on this. My handwriting was excellent. I didn't stutter. It was fantastic, and none of it recorded. So this is take 2, so it probably won't be as good as the first one, but that's okay. We're going to move ahead with the different organizations. First one we're going to discuss is the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored Persons. This was, you call it the granddaddy of them all. This was sprung from the Niagara movement, which you discussed last year in Mr. Pasquale's class. It is the oldest existing that I know of civil rights organization in the United States. And from the early, I think 1909 is whenever it formally became the NAACP. Before that, it was the Niagara movement. It had been pushing for civil rights way back through the modern era. It's still around today. So this was the main organization. Then you have these other organizations. We're going to scratch out that. Then you have the Montgomery Improvement Association. This came into being with Rosa Parks and her being arrested. This organization, the MIA, brought about the Montgomery bus boycott, helped fight for and end segregation on busing. And you had Martin Luther King Jr. and Mr. Abernathy involved. They also went on to form the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And the Southern Christian Leadership Conference focused on Jim Crow laws in the South and getting rid of those Jim Crow laws. So Mr. Abernathy and Dr. King pushed for ending those laws, pushing for civil rights in the South. So, and these are just going to be general overviews. That's all we're getting into. We're not going to go deep in the details because of the situation we're in with the learning online and time constraints and everything else. Now, Little Rock Nine is more of a group of people than it is an organization, but this deals with the 9 African American students in Little Rock, Arkansas, who fought to be integrated into the school, and that was the court case for Brown versus Board of Education. It also brings in Governor Faubus and President Eisenhower. We'll talk about that under actions. We're going to pause for a second. Hey, I remember to hit the button. It's a win for me. It's going to take us down to the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or the SNCC, and the Congress on Racial Equality Corps. These two organizations, were brought in, organized, developed, I don't want to say invented, but they were organized to bring younger people into the civil rights movement. People, college-age students, possibly high school students. The goal was to bring people in and get young people involved in the civil rights movement. You have James Farmer, one of the founding members of CORE. Stokely Carmichael, one of the founding members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Their whole point was to bring younger people in, energize the movement, get people started at an early age, and have them push for civil rights. The Interstate Commerce Commission was not an organization per se. It's a government entity. What it does is it polices and regulates interactions between the states. Anything that's the travel, business, anything between states falls under the jurisdiction of the federal government. If you stay within state borders, the federal government doesn't have much jurisdiction. Once you cross state lines, the federal government gets involved. And the Interstate Commerce Commission was used by Robert Kennedy and others in government to push and police the agenda on civil rights. They were able to enforce some of these laws because it dealt with interstate commerce, such as the freedom rides and interstate bus transportation, things of that nature. The last two we're going to discuss here, the Nation of Islam and the Black Panther Party. These two organizations did not push. They pushed for civil rights and they pushed for equality, but they did not push for integration. Both of these organizations believed in an African American region, their own African American state, if you will. They did not believe in, how can I phrase this? Having white Americans help African Americans in their push for equality. They didn't trust white Americans. Some people, both the Nation of Islam and Black Panther Party, believed that white America did not have African Americans' best interest at heart when they were doing things. And at times, even some of the others, some of the student chapters of the SNCC and CORE started going African American only, not including white Americans, based on this belief. And both of the Nation of Islam, the NOI, and the Black Panther Party, they believed in fighting violence with violence. They tended to not lean towards the nonviolent movement that many of the other organizations believed in. So this is just a cursory overview. Some people had said they were having trouble with Islam. Don't worry about the Islamic religion. We're not going to deal with that. Nation of Islam took some of the tenets, some of the beliefs of Islam, and applied them to their situation to kind of fit their agenda. You'll cover Islam, the main religion, next year in World Cultures, along with other religions. For this section, just know Nation of Islam, Black Panther Party, they had a different vision of civil rights and how people should approach the civil rights movement than many of the other organizations. That concludes review 1 on chapter 54. Hope it was helpful.